Chipped ham and football. That's what Pittsburgh does. A hopeless day, a hopeless end of the season for your beloved Steelers. I'm Brian Batko from the Post-Gazette. Probably the most dour way I've ever opened this show. That is kind of how it feels right now after yet another first round playoff exit. But more to the point, we just heard from Mike Tomlin a little bit ago here on Tuesday afternoon, his annual season wrap-up press conference. This verse, very much like the one from last year. What else really could he say differently? Nonetheless, going to break it all down with, I think, our first three-time guest on the show, Brooke Pryor of ESPN. She was there, as she always is, for Tomlin's comments, and we'll get into what stood out to us, what we gleaned, if anything, and kind of where this team goes from here. So hopefully you'll stick around to get our thoughts, as always, on the show, sponsored by Pella. No better place to get new windows and doors installed in your home than Pella, who can help you save on energy costs year-round. Schedule a free in-home consultation with your local Pella Windows and Doors to find the right product for your home and your budget. Give them a call at 866-593-1560 to discuss that project further. That's 866-593-1560 to get started planning your new windows and doors installation with Pella Windows and Doors of Pittsburgh. See, I can turn on the enthusiasm for the Pella read, even if I did intentionally start the show on a less than animated note. But maybe we'll get animated. Brooke and myself talking about the final Mike Tomlin presser of the 2024 season. We'll be right back with that. Stick around here to hear more on Chipped Ham and Football. All right, there she is, Brooke Pryor of ESPN. And Brooke, we're sitting here around the same time as last year. I think you joined me on this show in January 2024 to discuss Art Rooney II's comments about the Steelers and their perpetual state of 9-8, 10-7 first-round exit. Today, we're coming off of Mike Tomlin giving yet another familiar presser during the same situation. What was your biggest takeaway from Tomlin, and did anything stand out to you? Did it seem any different than years prior, especially last season?
You know, it felt different from last season because last season it felt like there was hope and there was emotion behind everything. And I wasn't sure what to expect going into this one. I thought that there could be some fireworks. I thought maybe we'd see more of that emotion, knowing that they came up short another year, especially when he said, I felt like we were better positioned to take that next step this season. And clearly they weren't.
Yeah, he basically was saying we had a better team this year, and we still, to use the Sean Elliott's words, defecated in the bed.
Yes, exactly. And I felt like his presser really reflected the vibe in the locker room Saturday night. Like, a lot of guys were just going through the motions. It felt very stale. I felt like he was stonewalling more than usual. I feel like normally these end of season wrap ups are somewhat introspective, and this was not introspective at all. It was how little can he give us with as many words as possible in some cases. So my takeaway is that there are going to be changes. What are those changes? Only he knows. And the two most memorable lines were about, how do you continue to carry this playoff baggage? I got big shoulders. And what do you say to teams who may be inquiring about your services in a trade? I have no message. Save your time. That's what it boiled down to. That's what I'll take from this.
Yeah, those were kind of the two most typical defensive Tomlin answers. And I mean, I did think when he got asked kind of straight up, like, and you do get these questions all the time too, I'm sure, Brooke, but like, so often fans are passionate and that's their place in this ecosystem. We have our own. They want us to pretty much get up there and say, Mike, why do you still have a job? Why should Art Rooney II keep you employed? Now, I understand that sentiment. And I mean, even many of us who cover this team or talk about this team on a regular basis think it's time that he should go. But you also need to have a little bit more tact in asking those questions. And when he did essentially get that topic thrown at him today, that's when he was basically like, yeah, I understand the criticism. I understand the urgency. I don't seek comfort. More importantly, I share that with the fans. So, I mean, that was kind of the most, I guess, self-aware answer that he gave. And sometimes a lot of times on this show during the season, we talk about football. On a day like today, we talk about a press conference and what the head coach had to say to try to glean just how much is he willing to adapt and change, because he always claims that he is, but it's not every offseason or every season that we see that so-called willingness to change actually put into action.
Yeah, a couple things along those lines jumped out to me. One, what he was saying about a saying that his team uses back at him sometimes, that 2 is a pattern. And when I hear that, I think, well, do you not think that 5 is a pattern, 6 is a pattern? Like, clearly there is a pattern here. And he said, in terms of losing these playoff games, and he says, well, I have adapted, just nothing's changed yet. It makes you wonder, like, well, how much are you really adapting? What is really changing? And that's the problem with these, reporter coach relationships in a press conference venue, is that they don't go into detail about, well, we moved meeting times to this, and we adjusted our practice schedule to this, and we switched up the scheme here. It just becomes these very vague statements of, well, we're changing. But I think about what he said about words are hollow, actions are what matter. Everything I've heard is hollow, and the action is that this team is still losing. So no matter what words you're using, when you look at actions, the action isn't changing. So what are you saying? That was one of the things that I felt wasn't very self-aware of him, to continue to harp on words don't matter, actions do, when the action or the result of those actions is the same thing. So maybe words do matter and you're not using the right ones. I don't know. I kept going in a circle with myself during the press conference, trying to figure out if I should ask point blank, should you still have a job if actions matter and your actions are losing in the playoffs? But
And he was sort of
I
asked about
value
that
my
too. I mean,
life.
he was basically like, that's a question for Art. I'll leave that for you to ask him, which is a fair response, honestly. And I didn't expect Mike Tomlin to get up there and say, look, guys, enough is enough. We've got to stop doing this. And the buck stops here. It starts with me. I need to do it. Like, that's never really been his tone or tenor. And he does say things that take accountability on the head coach first and foremost. But I do think a lot of impatient and frustrated fans, even those who aren't completely in the Fire Tomlin boat, or maybe even especially those who aren't in the Fire Tomlin boat, want him to take on a little bit more of that weight on those so-called big shoulders, especially because this was a season in which, deservedly so at times, Mike got to do a decent amount of puffing his chest out. When he was asked by our media colleague, Brandon Marshall, about going from Justin Fields to Russell Wilson and what gave him the faith to do that. And he's basically like, well, I'm well compensated. Okay. Now your season's ending with a 5-game losing streak and the playoff drought extended. He probably wasn't expecting or envisioning that Monday or Sunday night, whenever that was. Or even when you asked them after the Eagles game about how they prevent this from snowballing. I mean, Brooke, did you happen to know at the time who the next opponents were on the schedule when you asked him that? And he said, it's just a loss. Let's not get dramatic. Well, I mean, those things don't age well when you finish the season the way this team did.
That's exactly right. I think back to that moment all the time about the let's not be dramatic, let's not get dramatic. Because to me, it also just speaks to this disconnect, whether that's in the locker room to Mike to the public, whatever it is.
Yeah.
The dismissiveness of some of these questions that I think are incredibly valid in terms of how do you keep this from snowballing? There's a way to say, well, we have to flush it, or there's a better way to say it than taking that tone and using those words. But if you are going to take that tone, then you better make sure it doesn't snowball. That's kind of putting, I think, the cart before the horse a little bit. Like, you have to be able to back those words up with actions, which hasn't happened. But yeah, it just feels like this is the cycle of the Steelers that they have a season. Maybe things don't start out well. This year they obviously did. They start to gain some ground. Mike says something that at the time he's being celebrated and lauded for it, like the well-compensated line. And by the end of the year, oh, wow, that is really bad. Like the unleash hell in December. Like I wasn't even here for that. And I know how bad that is and how long that's hung around. It just feels like to me, the other thing when you talk about messaging that jumps out from the press conference today is I asked him, why are you confident that your message is still resonating with the players when the actions aren't there? And he was like, honestly, like it doesn't matter. Like the messaging doesn't matter was what he said. I think that's the TLDR of it. But
yeah, he's like, there's so many more components to it than messaging. And presumably he means like execution, technique, scheme,
right,
talent, etc.
But should it not all come back to the message? Like, how are you conveying what should be executed? How are you conveying what scheme should be run, what talent to bring in, what coaches to hire? Like, maybe messaging isn't the right word, but like messaging in terms of these are your directions. How are they being communicated? And are they the right things that you're saying?
Maybe culture is kind of the better catch-all there.
Exactly. And it seems like at this point it's not effective, because if it was effective, you wouldn't have Kirk Herbstreit saying in the second quarter of a playoff game that the Steelers have no fight. And I thought it was interesting too that repeatedly when he was asked about some of these outside opinions, rather than
inside in the case of Patrick Queen
or inside, rather than defend those, but rather than defend himself or defend his team, he went on the attack and said, well, everybody's entitled to an opinion, which naturally created the follow-up for, okay, so what's your opinion? It just, again, it felt like it was a very evasive press conference. And once again, we really learned nothing.
Yeah. And I guess, if he took truths here, he'd probably just tell you, well, I'm never going to get into, even if my opinion is that we aren't playing hard enough, it doesn't do me any good to say that publicly. And that's kind of the tack that he takes sometimes. I mean, I just think, to go back, when he said the thing about it's one loss, let's not get dramatic. They were 10-4 at the time, and they were probably fairly comfortable at 10-4 at that time. And for the coach whose biggest like buzzword cliche is that he doesn't seek comfort, I don't think he does seek comfort when it comes to things like criticism. It's not like he ever snaps back at the fans booing or all the vitriol on social media. I mean, he doesn't seek comfort from that sort of thing. But I just wonder if, to go back to what you're saying about the message or the culture or the identity of this team or just the entire way the operation is going in that organization, like, is everybody just a little bit too comfortable? I mean, is Mike Tomlin too comfortable with a defensive coordinator whom he promoted from within, from senior defensive assistant, or a lot of the same assistants that he's had on staff for a long time who, I mean, let's just be frank, don't have a ton of NFL experience, at least before their time with the Steelers. And and if that's indeed the case, will these things, and with one of the smallest coaching staffs in the NFL, at least relative to the teams that are still standing here on January 14th, if that's all the case, will this be the offseason that any of this comes home to roost and there's a little bit more of a challenge to Tomlin's power from the outside? I don't know. That to me, I guess, is kind of like the main question that I have about how he can back up words with action in terms of being willing to change, adapt, do things differently. I know they got a new strength and conditioning staff this year. It went terribly. He even mentioned right off the bat all the soft tissue injuries. That strength and conditioning staff was from Boston College, where Mike's son plays college football. So, like, there's just a lot of...
Who hired them?
Right, like, yes. That's what I mean.
The only uncomfortable thing about the Steelers right now and the organization is how little parking there is on the south side for players, coaches, staff. Like,
well, they never have an issue for finding spots. We do. In the
no, I have seen Steelers players have to double park because like it's bad. That is the most uncomfortable thing about it. You make such a great point that for a guy who doesn't seek comfort, he has the most comfortable setup in the NFL, because who is challenging him? The
GM, and I'm not saying Omar Khan's doing a bad job, but the GM had been on staff for a really long time. and went from a role that was essentially under Mike to now, at least on paper, being above him. But yeah, that's another good point.
Right. And even Arthur Smith, who had NFL experience as a head coach, said frequently, all of that's on Mike. I just play with the players he tells me to use. And he talked about enjoying basically being siloed to the offense, which on the one hand, like, you're right, it's not his role to question the head coach. But if your specialty is offense, like, in some way, shouldn't you be able to push back a little bit? I don't know how much of a hand Mike Tomlin had in the offensive game plan. We know he wanted Russell Wilson because he gave him pole position, all of those things. But this is what happens when you have unchecked power and these extensions. You might not be seeking comfort, but you've built it. And the organization and people around, exactly, the people around you have helped you get that. So you can't manufacture discomfort. Like, are you going to sit on the floor when there's a chair right beside you? No.
He's going to go in the booth for a game and let all the assistants coach on the field. No, yeah, I mean, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. And same church, different pew. When you talk Arthur Smith, like, I didn't think it was a bad hire. I don't even necessarily think he did a bad job in his first season. It certainly fizzled out, I think, for a lot of reasons, and he needs to do a better job if he's going to be in this role again in year two. But when they hired him, it was a pretty Steelers-y hire. I think most people could agree on that. He was a run-first guy. They did not go to the McVay or the Shanahan tree or see what Cliff Kingsbury was up to, who, by the way, I think has done a pretty darn good job this season with the Commanders. So, yeah, I mean, even if I don't necessarily disagree with the result or the guy himself who was hired to do that job, the process and kind of the mindset, the thinking, the philosophy, yet another example of, the staleness, the same old Steelers stuff that people are just brainstorming and spitballing any ideas to try to reinvigorate or send some kind of jolt through this franchise.
Which I think is why it's interesting that when Will Graves asked Mike Tomlin today, is this organization stuck? Mike said, no, we're not stuck, because stuck is feeling helpless, and I don't think we're helpless. But then Will followed up and said, okay, well, then why are you optimistic? And Mike said, well, we're not optimistic either. I'm not going to sell that. It's like, well, then it kind of sounds like you're stuck.
That answer should be studied by psychologists at elite universities or something, because I tweeted that out and somebody was like, what does that mean? That makes zero sense to me.
I frequently come out of those press conferences with my brain tied in a knot, trying to think through what everything means and what answers contradict the other ones. It's mind-boggling. I don't know that we're all any smarter for it.
But don't get me wrong. If you would have said, we feel good about the development of our young guys and we've got players coming back, like, people would have ripped him for that too. They would have said, stop trying to paper over all the failures and struggles this year. So, I mean, he kind of led with that, hey, we finished 10-8, essentially. Nothing I can say really is going to save me from all the slings and arrows. But yeah, I mean, at this point, very similar to previous years. And now we will see, he never really makes the staff changes prior to this presser. But we'll see what staff changes are to come. It seems like it's almost a foregone conclusion that there's going to be a shakeup to some degree. We just don't necessarily know how many or who at this point.
Exactly. I think that offensive line is probably an area where we will see a change. Defensive coordinator or defensive assistants, I think that there will be a handful of them. And also something to keep an eye on, Arthur Smith is still interviewing for head coaching jobs. He was tapped by the Jets and someone else.
The Bears reported.
Bears, that's right. So he's going to be interviewing for those.
Are the ones that are gaining a little bit of speculative momentum or steam, I suppose, right, with Arthur Smith for whatever reason. So yeah, boy, wouldn't that be wild if the Steelers are back in an offensive coordinator search? But suddenly it's for a much different reason than most people would have anticipated.
Expect the unexpected. You make a hardcore plan, but we land on your feet. That's my favorite Tomlinism.
All right, Brooke, last thing before we go, because it is probably an even bigger topic than Tomlin's job security. What did you make of what he said about the quarterbacks? Do you kind of just boil it down to, like, on this day last year, he was asked point blank, do you think your quarterback's on your roster for next season? Yes. I think it was me who said, what did you learn about Kenny Pickett late in the season when he wasn't playing? And he's like, I'm even more confident in his intangibles. All that stuff went out the window within the next, month or two.
Yeah.
Did you, so like, are you putting any stock into the stuff he had to say about Russell Wilson, or more so, I guess, Justin Fields, because we hadn't really seen him for a couple of months? You can say no, because it's
no,
entirely fair to say no.
I feel a couple things. One, I feel like we have asked him every single year for like 3 or 4 years, how much do you value quarterback mobility? And every year he said he values it. And then this year he had an opportunity to continue valuing it, and he went with the less mobile option. Even though Russ is more mobile than like other quarterbacks he could have had, he's still 35-year-old Russell Wilson.
Well, Tomlin himself was the one when he made the change. It was like, there is a big gap between those two guys or whatever. So
exactly. So I don't really put stock in what he says, but I do think it's kind of a Rorschach test. Like, what do you want to hear? Do you want to hear that he thinks that both quarterbacks are good? Do you want to hear that Justin Fields is the guy? Because you could easily take what he said and say, okay, well, he wants Justin Fields to compete, not only because he said that, he's seen leadership gains and he learned things about him in those 6 weeks, but also when he said that, yes, he's going to consider Russell Wilson's age when you look at bringing him back. Like, and that he said he would be comfortable with Justin in the pole position. But, I mean, an hour and a half after that press conference, they signed Skylar Thompson. What does that mean? I don't think Skylar Thompson's QB1. But
probably nothing.
Who knows?
But
yeah, I wish I could say that I'm taking stock in this and that I feel more confident about the direction of the Steelers quarterback room, because that would make off-season story planning a lot easier, but I'm not. And I think it's going to be more of the same until we get through maybe the first or second week in free agency. And then who knows? Could end up being a draft situation too.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we learned anything from last year, combining the final Tomlin presser and then the moves they actually made at QB, Tomlin either lies through his teeth when he gets those questions, or is very susceptible to changing his mind, or does get pressure from some other sources within the organization to switch up how they do things. All right, Brooke. Well, anything else before I let you go?
Not anything other than I hope that we all get a nice hibernation now while we have some time off and are waiting for those big changes to happen in Pittsburgh. Mike Tomlin's got a lot of unearthing to do. So,
yes, he does. He used that word quite a few times today on Tuesday. So, well, for Brooke Pryor of ESPN, thanks so much for joining me, and hope everybody enjoyed our conversation. See you, Brooke. All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Again, I'm Brian Batko from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. You're watching a show also with a quick message from Goldberg, Persky, and White. If you were diagnosed with mesothelioma or lung cancer, call your local attorneys at Goldberg, Persky, and White. For more than 40 years, their firm has represented thousands of lung cancer and mesothelioma victims. Call 1-800-COMPLEX or visit gpwlaw.com for a free consultation. Stick with the Post-Gazette for plenty more coverage of this 2024 Steelers season now in the books. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.